Okay, this is video lecture number 4 for Humanities 1, and I hope everybody's doing okay on the test. It's due date's coming up on it. I don't see many of them completed, which worries me always, but I'm sure you guys are working on them. Once again, if there's any troubles, please get in touch with me. I did manage to set up an assignment and not actually set it up so that everyone can see it, not for this class, but for another section. So that kind of thing I need to know. And I can't find out about this stuff unless some student tells me. I can't see things from your end on Blackboard. So please let me know if there's something I need to fix or change. Um, our chapter, and I apologize for doing page numbers instead of chapter headings, because I assumed that your ebook has page numbers and it doesn't. So this will help you find where we're at in the book. Um, we're in the area where it's after the fall of Rome and Europe is being reorganized under a new cultural identity. So the paganism and the mythology of Rome that's been the foundation for that civilization forever and ever has fallen by the wayside. And Rome has lost its power and its authority. There's an interesting fact. The very smallest nation on the planet is Liechtenstein. It's somewhere around Austria, somewhere Austria and Switzerland in there somewhere. I've been there. I just was passing through there from one competition to another, and there's Liechtenstein. So let's go see it. It's a tiny little place, 10 square miles about. It's a little nook in this valley, and it's surrounded by mountains. Um, it still has a king and a queen. It's still a feudal situation, if that can be applied to a modern circumstance. But the interesting thing about Liechtenstein, the smallest nation in the world, is that it is the only thing that's left of the Roman Empire. So from the time that Rome conquered that area until this very day, that one little place, Liechtenstein, has still been a part of the Roman Empire. And I think it's interesting that the greatest civilization, the most powerful civilization, arguably, in the history of the world, um, now is has been reduced right to the smallest country. Um, but what took its place? Well, Christianity did, and European Christianity, and these are the times of knights and castles and that sort of thing. And a great deal of new mythology comes out of this. It's a Christian mythology, though. And that's what's fascinating. We have the mythology of Rome, and we've spoken at length about what foundational myths are. Well, with the decline of learning and the loss of high civilization that happens here after the fall of Rome, you end up in a situation where we're once again out of the realm of history and into the realm of myths and legends. And anytime human beings lose touch with history in terms of just this history of what happens, the first historians are Greeks and Romans, people who are writing down history saying we need to have a record of this is what happened. Um, well, that's lost, more or less, with the fall of Rome. And illiteracy becomes much more prevalent. The superficial trappings of civilization fall away. And we're back into a time of legends. And so the legends of King Arthur and Lancelot and Gawain and the Knights of the Round Table, all that stuff. Beowulf, which is the Anglo-Saxon mythological story that your book talks about. This is mythology again. It's a mythology hundreds and hundreds of years after the mythology that the Roman world was built on. But it's mythology nonetheless. We don't know how much of Arthur's legend is history and how much is myth, much like with the story of the Greeks and the Trojans and Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, there and all that other stuff, right? And Jason the Argonauts, all these old Roman and Greek myths do have some setting in history. And archaeologists have been surprised again and again to find the places mentioned in these accounts. The same is true of Arthur, and you know, he existed in history, but no history was written down about him. All we have is by word of mouth that's passed down to us and was finally written down. The actual writing down the legends of Arthur and the Round Table happens many hundreds of years after the fact. These stories exist in an oral form and were more than likely sung by, not more than likely, they were absolutely sung by bards. Just as Homer was a bard and sung his great epic, right? um, Mythology begins again. But it's a Christian mythology. It's a mythology with a background in a different world. The affairs of the gods and the ways the gods interact with people and all the things that occupy the Roman and Greek minds in their mythology, that has changed. And so these stories are about Christianity as much as anything else. And we derive a great deal from that. The Black Knight, right? And the White Knight. These are archetypes in our culture that come out of that mythology. You don't have that same thing in the Greek and Roman world. When when um, Hector is fighting Achilles, uh, Hector's not the Black Knight, and Achilles isn't the White Knight. They're both flawed in their way. If anything, Hector's the more uh, uh, relatable character in that story. But the idea of good and evil going to battle with one another over the treatment of people, specifically the treatment of the weak and the um, those who have no one to speak for them, those who have no place or stature in society. This is the thing that Arthur's legends are focused upon, and you can't have that question. You can't even have that discussion without Christianity as the background. Earlier in the semester, I talked about how the treatment of children in Christianity is different, radically different from what the ancient world was doing and was all about. Um, well, that leads to a particular Christian kind of idea of the strong protecting the weak. The child is weak, the child is helpless, the child can't fend for themselves. And it's the duty of others to take care. The same thing is true of the poor, of the sick, of the needy, and women, right? We have this idea of the knight protecting the fair maiden, right? This is what should strength be used for? And I think it's important to note that the shape of force, of power in that world was all about steel and a horse, basically. An armored knight mounted was a tank. They were nearly invulnerable to the weapons of that age. Battles between knights were very violent, but not terribly bloody. You really had to work at it to kill a knight. And the stories of the wars of the Middle Ages, there's a lot of ransoming that goes on. It's just a given that the side that wins a battle, a pitched battle, is going to take a lot of hostages because they're mostly still alive out there. Now, don't get me wrong, people did die in this stuff, but knights could literally beat at one another with with swords encased in all that metal until they just fell down exhausted without any decision being made on the field of battle. That's why jousting was a was a thing. Imagine this, right? You've got lances, heavy spears. They're about 14 feet long. You have two men encased in armor charging at one another on these things. And they are going to spear each other at full speed on horseback. And remember, this isn't just the speed of a horse against something stationary. These two horses running together at one another. So everything gets doubled. And this was so not deadly that it was a pastime. It's a sport for fun, right? That gives you an idea of how powerful armor was. And because of that, anyone who had it was could do whatever they wanted to, more or less. And that's the story of the Black Knight, this idea of the evil knight that's out there in the world, using their power using their armor and their invincibility to do what they want and do evil, right? To waylay passerbys, passerbys. It's late. I'm not talking well. Waylay people who are trying to cross a bridge, for instance. That's a typical Black Knight scenario. Or abducting, right, a maiden from the village, and the White Knight's got to go out and deal with this. Um, there's some fascinating stuff in all that mythology, but that's it comes echoing down to us through this kind of quasi historical, quasi mythological time, and these stories are so powerful to our culture that we tell them all the time. I mean, how many feature films have been made about knights, right? How many of these really fascinating fictional stories are set in times of medieval sort of technology and social structure. Um, so um, that's kind of where we're at. And let me go back to my notes here. Hang on. Um, I want to talk about the shape of this culture. We've mentioned it already, but it's important to know that medieval culture arises out of the Roman culture, and it shares some of those characteristics. So in Rome, you had a person who was the um, patron, the rich, wealthy person who lived in a big house who was responsible for everybody in the community. And beneath him were the plebeians, who were the ordinary folks in that area. And above the patron, right, the very top of the social order is the emperor. And with the Middle Ages, you have the same sort of thing, except you have a king instead of an emperor, and the areas are smaller. The world gets divided up into all these tiny kingdoms. And then you have your nobleman, who would be in the place of a patrician, a patron in uh, Roman culture. And then the serfs, right, were the people who would have been either lower class workers or even slaves in the ancient world. And there's this gradual elimination of slavery that happens, and the serfs are the first step in that. The serfs, they don't own their land. The land is owned by the nobleman and ultimately by the king. But the serf is allowed to work the land and has some autonomy and freedom in what they do. And the relationship between the ruled and the ruler becomes much more a question of reciprocity, as opposed to simply do it because I said so and I own you kind of thing. Um, I want to talk a little bit about, and this isn't in your book, none of this is in your book, this is just some of my own studies. There's a fascinating thing about the Arthurian legends, the contrast between Sir Lancelot and Gawain. And these are the names that we know. If you are steeped in this at all, right, you should know Arthur, Guinevere, Merlin, Lancelot, and Gawain. Those are the big major characters in that series of legends. And what's fascinating is that Lancelot is the best knight of all in the world. And, this is the legend is that he's never been defeated, can't be defeated. But he also is a very flawed individual. And the tragedy of the Arthurian cycle is when Lancelot actually um, has an affair with Guinevere. And that's the beginning of the end for Arthur's um, kingdom. But Gawain isn't as good a knight as Lancelot in terms of just being able to win battles. But he's Arthur's best knight. He's the most pure of heart. And that contrast between these two, the knight who's more formidable but flawed, the knight who is less formidable but pure. And that debate between these two types of people kind of informs the whole long cycle of stories that involve the Knights of the Round Table. Another interesting thing is, switch gears here, the justice system of this time was interesting, but you would have this is just part of the medieval world. One of the ways you could settle a dispute was trial by combat. So you could literally, it was a kind of sanctioned dueling. If you can't work it out, we're just going to fight about it. And some of these duels were conducted to the death, some of them weren't. But what is really fascinating is that if a woman wanted to um, do trial by combat, they could do it. And they would actually handicap the fight. There's some lithographs of one of these where one of the guy, the knight, right? So it's a woman versus knight. And he has been buried up to his waist in a hole in the ground, has one hand tied behind his back. They're getting after it, right? Don't know who won, but they would actually handicap the thing so that women could avail themselves of medieval justice. Um, the Another tradition that rose out of this was nobility having their own champions. That was the idea of being the king's champion. So there's kind of we're moving towards a kind of egalitarian system here because the king himself has to keep a warrior on hand to answer these trials by combat. So in certain instances, the king or the nobility wouldn't actually have to take the field and fight a trial by combat, but they would have someone who would stand in their place. And that's the king's champion. Well, there's only one of those left in the world, which is hilarious to me. I'll read this to you. I did some research on this. Queen Elizabeth II, which is the Queen of England now, right, still retains a royal champion to defend the throne should someone challenge her to a trial by combat. The man who holds the office of Queen's Champion and standard bearer of England today is named Francis John Fane Merriman Drymoke. That's the most British name I've ever heard in my life. This guy has 1, 2, 3, 5 names. Francis John Fane Merriman Drymoke. He's 64 years old and works mostly as an accountant. So obviously it's a ceremonial position. That would make a great story. I should write that. Someone actually showing up to challenge for the throne of England in a trial by combat. And they've got to drag out the poor accountant. I'm sorry, it's late. Everything's waiting me right now. Where do I want to go from this? Let's see. I want to talk a little bit about Charlemagne, and then I'll finish this up. And Roland. So one of the great stories, and one of these legendary things, right? Arthur is and Lancelot and that crew, the Round Table. That is a English legend. France has their own legends, and their guy is Charlemagne, and he was a real person in history. His sword, which is a named blade, one of those magic swords from that time in history, is actually on display in the French. They have it in the Louvre, I think. You can see it. It's this fabulous gold-hilted medieval sword. Charlemagne is a French king, and he does a great deal towards repelling the Islamic invasions that happened during this time. This is before the Crusades, right? I've mentioned already the Crusades were kind of a counterattack. Islam tried to steamroll over Europe, and Charlemagne was largely responsible for stopping that from happening. Now, at this time, remember, Rome has fallen. Rome is a dump. It literally just the city dies. There's some old paintings from this time of the Colosseum, and it's literally in an empty field. That's how much the nature had kind of taken over what was once the heart of Rome. Rome had dwindled into just a city of ruins and a very small population. But the Pope kept his place there. And the papacy did move to France for a short period of time. But Rome is the seat of Peter, and that's why the Pope was there. He's like, I can't leave the place. Peter was the first bishop of Rome, and the Pope to this very day is the bishop of Rome. But Charlemagne goes to visit the Pope. I don't know why. It's part of the story, but I don't know that part of it. But he goes to visit the Pope. He goes to Mass. And during Mass, one of the things you do is at the end is you go forward to receive communion. Well, Charlemagne comes down, and the Pope grabs a crown that he's got there and sets it on Charlemagne's head without warning him. He's going to do this. And he crowns Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor. Charlemagne is not happy about this, but he does kind of accept that role, and he is involved in a lot of the campaigns against the Islamic people in Spain, and they called them Saracens then. Um, and the story, the most known legend that comes out of this time is the story of Roland. Roland is one of Charlemagne's captains. And he also has a named blade called Durandal, which is the best name for a sword ever. Um, and it's not like it's a French word. No one knows what it means. But the name of the sword was Durandal. And when Charlemagne is returning from one of his campaigns in Spain, he's crossing the Pyrenees to get back into France. And the legend is that Roland and his small band of the rear guard of Charlemagne's army is the last one to go through this kind of pass through this mountainous area. He's the tail end of Charlemagne's army as it's going through. And um, Roland gets cut off and ambushed by a band of Saracens. And the story, Roland has not only you can tell J.R.R. Tolkien was influenced by this, he also has a war horn that's also kind of this magical, mythical thing. It's made from the tusk of an elephant. And um, when they're under attack, the people around Roland, his adjutants who, in command of that force, uh, ask him, say, blow your horn, call Charlemagne back, we need help here. And Roland refuses to do it. And it's kind of a story about pride, amongst other things. But in the end, he's defeated. And it's this interesting thing, right? In many ways, Roland is kind of the Christian Hector. Now, Hector comes out of the Iliad and Odyssey as the most relatable and the most popular character, right? Now, I've mentioned this when we talked about that. No one names their children Achilles. You don't do that. But there are Hectors all over the world, especially in the southern part of the Americas. Well, Roland, uh, he's a flawed character. He relies on his strength too much. He realizes I've got a magical sword. I have this. I can deal with this. And Roland kind of represents a very early version of the story of the heroic last stand, of the person outnumbered who, fights to the bitter end. And that's Roland's story. And there's this poignance to it. There's this kind of I don't know. It's why it's a story that lives with us, because it is an interesting thing. And in the end of this tale, Roland has his back to this cliff wall, and he's surrounded by the Saracens, and he's trying to fight them off. And he realizes that it's too late. He's going to die, and so he blows the horn. And Charlemagne hears this horn blowing in the distance, but it's too late. And in the end, Roland breaks Durandal so that the Saracens won't get his sword. And that's kind of the story of Roland. And the Middle Ages is full of that kind of thing. The unlikely hero and um, the hero that sacrifices themselves in certain ways. And my favorite knight of that whole era of the world is Joan of Arc. And what's cool about Joan of Arc is she belongs absolutely to history. Joan of Arc happens a long time after the events that we think of as the Arthurian era. But she's a real person, and in many ways, Joan of Arc is the last of these paladins of the Middle Ages. Because she shows up in a time when history has taken off again, right? We know that everything that is her history is absolutely true. There is no mythology to it. Eyewitnesses, um, contemporary accounts of what she did are copious. There's lots of them out there, and she was amazing. She was a 16-year-old French girl who thought God had called her to liberate France from England, and she went to war. She also had a magical sword. Um, one of the legends about her, legend, it's history. She was, God had told her in a vision that there was a sword buried behind the altar of this specific small church out in the middle of nowhere, small village in France, and it was a crusader's sword who had buried it behind the altar there. And that was the sword she went to battle with. Another fascinating character from that era and that age, but late in that age. Um, so hope everybody's doing good on the test. I'm exhausted. I don't know if it made any sense at all during this lecture, but here it is. And I will throw another one up as soon as I can get to it. Everybody stay healthy and stay safe.